I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about selling magazines. Um, it's a subject that I think often gets left right until the end when it can kind of be too late. And I hope that I'm going to be able to show that there are really good reasons to think about the ways that you'll sell a magazine right back at the beginning when you're thinking about stuff like the name and how big it should be and all of these other practical considerations. So first of all, I will introduce Stack and kind of explain how I got to be doing this. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about independent magazines and particularly how they are different to mainstream magazines because they run in a very, very different way. And then I'm going to go over the three main ways that I think you probably will end up selling your magazine. And guess what? There are advantages and disadvantages to each of those ways of selling magazines. So I'll run through those. And I've also included some examples of things that independent magazines are doing, which just try to kind of come at these problems from a slightly different angle. Maybe that will provide you with some inspiration for ways that you could do it, or at least hopefully kind of get you thinking about alternatives to just like the sort of like the straight by the book way of doing things. Okay, so let me just share this. Okay, and oh my goodness. There, that's what I want. All right, there we go. So as I said, I run a service called Stack, and effectively, Stack is this. Every month we send out a different independent magazine. You never know what you're going to get next, but you do know it will be this beautiful, intelligent, independent magazine that you probably haven't come across before. Every month when we send the magazines out, a few days later, we start to see people posting pictures of their magazines at home. And we get some kind of tropes running through this. So on the left-hand side over here, we have lots of people taking pictures of their magazines kind of at their desk. I think I think that's communicating, look at me with my creative job, and I need lots of inspiration coming across my desk to kind of fuel me through my day. And we have lots of soft furnishings in these pictures, lots of people in bed, lots of kind of blankets and cushions and things. And again, I think, that's someone saying like, look at me in my kind of downtime with my cool independent magazine. We have lots of dogs and cats in these pictures, which I think is probably mainly just people showing off their pets. And we have lots of pints of beer and lots of cups of coffee. And again, I think just kind of like giving this sense of like, look, this is me relaxing, and this is how I like to relax. Um, I started Stack, I think 16 years ago now. So I was working as an editor on an in-flight magazine, and feeling a little bit kind of desperate, not very inspired. Like working on an in-flight magazine is, on the one hand, really fun. You get to fly off to different places, or at least you did when I did it. I'm thinking maybe they don't do that these days. And like, we'd go and like stay in nice hotels and eat in nice restaurants and stuff. But then the kind of stories that you could tell were really just the same old boring stories that, kind of whichever PR was looking after you wanted you to tell. And so, I, I started just kind of looking around other things. And I discovered Little White Lies, which is a movie magazine. And each issue, they focus on a different film and they shape everything about the magazine around that film. So, I mean, obviously, the stories and the interviews, but also the design of the magazine, like every little detail is informed by that movie. And when I first came across Little White Lies, I just felt like this is being made for me. These people see films in the same way that I do. And so I contacted them and I started writing for them. At that time, they couldn't afford to pay their writers. So instead, every time there's a new issue, I got invited to a big party. And so I got to know the people who make the magazine really well through that. And also then got to know a bunch of other people who were involved in making independent magazines. Um, so that, kind of like ran along for a couple of years. This incredibly bad piece of design is supposed to represent the big bang moment of Stack. This guy is a fellow called Russell Davies, who writes a really interesting blog, and I read it religiously. And one of his kind of hobby horses is how to be interesting. And he wrote this post about a good way to be interesting is to read a different magazine. I think he said every week, because magazines represent this whole constellation of like ideas and opinions, and you can just sit at home and like let them arrive to your sofa. And I just thought that's such a nice idea, the idea of like a magazine as a way of being interesting. And then around the same time, my friend's wife bought him a subscription to a t-shirt company. And every month he'd get a different limited edition t-shirt delivered to his door. And he never knew what he was going to get next, but he always loved these little t-shirts. And so I just sort of thought, like, could you put together those two things of magazines as a way of being interesting with this super simple delivery method that has kind of like surprise built into it. And so I think that was like kind of September 2008. And then in December 2008, I launched Stack. I think I thought that was going to be in time for Christmas. I now know that's not in time for Christmas. But Stack was born. This was my old living room table. And so every month I'd get a bunch of magazines in. I had all the envelopes at home. I write a letter that goes out with each magazine to explain what it is, and you can see the letters there. So I printed the letters, printed everybody's names on sticky labels, and I would pack every single one myself. You can see there we're sending out little white lies in that month. I would pack everything up myself. And then carry it down to the post office. And the post office hated me because you're really not supposed to do that. And like, kind of quite soon after starting that, I realized this is a bad way of doing it. And I figured out that instead of like, kind of going and buying stamps at the post office counter, you could print your postage and stick it onto the envelope. So that made everything easier. And then I realized that if you pay like £12, the post office will send a postman to your door. So you don't have to go to the post office. And so it's like kind of, this has sort of been the story of Stack of like, try something, take it to the point where like something's going to break, and then be forced to find a slightly better way of doing it. These days, our magazines all kept in a nice big warehouse in Kent. So this is kind of one of our like avenues of racks. And so now when somebody subscribes or somebody buys a copy of a magazine from us, I personally do not have to go and get that magazine and send it out, which is a much better way of doing things and makes way more sense. Um, okay, right. I want to think for a minute about what is an independent magazine. And like there is simply no good definition of this, or at least there's no perfect definition of this, because while you say independent magazine, I think everyone kind of gets an image in their head of what that means. But when you start trying to kind of really pin it down and come up with some parameters that everyone could agree with, it all gets quite vague and sort of slippery. And so I use the Indicon 2014 definition. So Indicon is like a magazine fair. Well, it started as a conference and then kind of added in like a marketplace. And it happens in Hamburg every kind of August, September. And I went to the first one in 2014 and spent a brilliant weekend with a bunch of German people, all discussing the first theme, which was Was ist Indie? So they were just trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? What does it mean for a magazine to be independent? And at the end of that weekend, there was no definition that was arrived at. But I think the best thing that I heard was the chiefs are the makers, and so the people who are financially responsible for the magazine are also directly involved in writing or editing or like maybe taking photos or something like that. And so, like I say, that is not a perfect definition, but I do think that it at least gives you a bit of a framework to begin with. And that's really important because independent magazines are fundamentally different to the mainstream. So if you think of like, kind of the big mainstream magazines, which, as we all know, are having a very, very difficult time at the moment, they're made differently. So the biggest mainstream magazines will be printed on like a web-fed printer. So that's where the paper's on like a great big reel, and basically all the plates are made up, and then they start printing, and it literally just like whoosh, it's the paper shoots through so fast. There's actually only one printer left like that in the UK. I mean, that's an indication of how badly the mainstream print business is doing. Um, so that that's I think we're sort of coming to the end of that era, but this is still the sort of thing that most people think of when they think of like, oh yeah, a magazine. So you're thinking of like the Radio Times or something like that. Whereas the big ones will be printed on like the web-fed printer. Independent magazines are going to be made on sheet-fed printers. So instead of this enormous reel of paper that just whizzes through, it's literally it's individual sheets of paper, still very big sheets of paper, that are placed onto the printer and printed. And that has a massive implication for the type of paper that you use, the kind of effects that you can get. They're fundamentally different things. They are still pieces of paper which are bound on one side, but if you look at the way that's been made, they're very, very different, and that has a big impact on the business model behind it. Independent magazines are made for different reasons. A mainstream magazine is basically made at the end of the day because it's going to make money. It needs to make money for the publisher. Independent magazines are much more likely to be made because somebody has just got this like itch that they have to scratch. There's a thing that they really particularly care about, and they see it as being best expressed in income paper. And of course, they're made on a completely different scale. And I think it's useful to think of independent magazines as being somehow like kind of small batch production. So, we all know that, I don't know, a loaf of Hovis bread is bread, but we wouldn't confuse that with a lovely, like, artisanal loaf that you've gone and picked up from the farmer's market at the weekend. Like, they're both loaves of bread, but we know they're fundamentally different things. So that really informs what an independent magazine can be. The biggest difference with independent and mainstream magazines is advertising. So advertising is the way that most large mainstream magazines make their money. And this has been the case for 100 years or more. If they can make their money from the advertising that is in the magazine, that takes the pressure off the cover price, which is why when you go and stand in WH Smith's, you'll see there's like, kind of, I've got no idea how much Radio Times costs these days, but I'm going to guess it at something like £4 or £5, something like that. And you're getting quite a lot for your money with that. And, the same is true for any of those mainstream magazines that you'll see there. They can afford to charge that low price because they're really making their money from the advertising inside. And so then the whole kind of game is about printing lots of copies and getting them in front of as many eyeballs as you can. So the incentive there is to kind of go big, is to try to make sure that these magazines are seen by as many people as you can, distribute them as widely as you can, and accept that. So for these magazines, if they get a 40% sell through, so that means that, like, so they sell 40% of the magazines that they print and send out. That's kind of considered okay. That's a decent sell through rate. Obviously, in terms of things like, the environment and the wastage, that's like really bad. But this is the industry as it has grown up. And all of this hinges on sale or return. So sale or return basically means that you get paid for the copies that have sold. Anything that hasn't sold, the cover is torn off and sent back to the publisher to prove that that copy didn't sell. Now, again, there are like lots of bad things about all of this, particularly when it comes down to environmental stuff. But this is the way that the industry's grown up. Now, when it comes to the independents, I'm not sure that yet, that makes no sense. When you're making an independent magazine, you probably don't have advertising in there, or at least you're not making money from it. So you have to charge more for your magazine. So then it just doesn't make sense to say, okay, you're going to like rip the cover off and destroy my stock. Now, as I said, kind of with the definition of what is an independent magazine, you get your kind of like edge cases. Now, The Gentlewoman is obviously like phenomenally successful magazine. In terms of the Indicon test, it totally passes it as an independent. So the guys who run it are like actively involved in the creative act of making it too. But this magazine has a ton of advertising in there, really good advertising, and it actually really contributes to the whole kind of editorial product. So The Gentlewoman, kind of this runs on a much more kind of traditional 20th century mainstream magazine model. So it's not to say that like kind of, independence one thing, mainstream another, that like there is kind of like blurring, but The Gentlewoman's kind of an outlier in the independent world. So as I say, without ads, you take away the advertising and like just everything changes. So I mean, lots of people who are making independent magazines still assume that they need to print a lot of copies. And partly that comes from the economies of scale, because, they'll speak to the printer and the printer will say, well, yeah, we could print you 1,000 copies of this, but for like, £200 more, we could print you 2,000. It's like, why wouldn't I do that? Of course I'll do that. Except, of course, when those magazines get delivered to your house or wherever it is you're storing them, and you realize just how many 1,000 is. I mean, we're like in the early days of Stack, when I was doing everything in my living room for 2 weeks of the month. I'd wake up in the morning and the first thing that I smelled was magazines, because they were stored in the corridor just outside my bedroom. And people do that thing of like getting their new independent magazine and opening it and going, that lovely independent magazine smell. It doesn't work like that when that's literally all you can smell in your house. So, all this is to say, there's often an assumption that you're making a magazine, so you need to print lots of them. I'd say if you're not planning to put advertising in there, you don't need to print lots of them. And actually, it makes much more sense to look at it as kind of analytically as you can and figure out how many of these do I reasonably think that I can sell, and then basically print that, and then figure out like, kind of, all right, it doesn't really make sense for this magazine to be in like every newsagent. So then which ones do I want to try to reach? Like, where do I think it's going to do well? If you don't have advertising in there, you've got to make your money from somewhere. And so it's probably the cover price. So that means that it's a more expensive product. And again, this feeds into where that magazine should be, because if you're then going to put your magazine next to the stuff in WH Smith's, and you're charging £15 for your magazine, that looks like incredibly expensive if you're sitting next to a £4 magazine. So it's having that kind of awareness of like, how will this product be perceived? Because the last thing that you want is to spend all this time and money and effort making this thing that you care very passionately about, and then you receive a package with a load of covers that have been torn off. That just doesn't make sense on the independent end. Now, at this point, this is kind of like most independent publishers, because the honest truth is that nobody ever started making a magazine because they really wanted to fill in spreadsheets and keep track of retail sales and chase somebody for a check for £13. Like, obviously, that's not why you do it. But then that is a symptom, I think, of making selling the magazine the thing that just happens at the end. It's that kind of, it's that thing of going like, all right, we're going to spend like hours and hours agonizing over the kind of the text and these beautiful images, and we're going to spend a lot of money to print it as beautifully as we can. And then you get to the end, you're like, how are we going to sell this? I don't know, send it to some shops. Actually, if you make all of this a creative challenge, first of all, you're much more likely to do a good job of it. And also it just becomes more interesting. It becomes a thing that you can engage with rather than just like sort of submitting to the drudgery of it. Okay, so the question is, how do you go about doing that? Right. As I said at the start, I think there are probably three main ways that you will sell your magazine. So retail, like in the real world, so as in like sending it to shops and selling it through shops, selling it through your own shop online, and then subscription. And as I said, all of these have their advantages and disadvantages. So let's jump into some of those. Okay, so retail. A lot of independent publishers view retail as effectively a marketing expense. It's great for having that magazine out on the shelf in the place where people can just discover it without actively looking for it. And if you look at the way that magazines are made, the actual anatomy of a magazine lends itself to selling in this environment. So, your most important page of any magazine is the cover. That's the thing that's got to like stop somebody across the room and make them come and pick the magazine up. And then you open it and you've got the editor's letter in there, which is this brilliant, concise opportunity to explain to a prospective reader what your magazine's all about. You've got the contents page that kind of at a glance shows all the different things in there. So that, this is stuff that has evolved over 300 years of magazines existing to mean that these objects sell particularly well in a shop. It also can lend like a seal of approval. So, if you have a particular set of shops that you really want to be sold by, if you can say, well, yes, we're sold by Mag Culture in London and Atheneum in Amsterdam, this kind of the fact that they are stocking you in their shop, it can be like a real kind of feather in your cap. So I think that there's a good argument for selling in shops like that, but all as part of this kind of a way of gaining exposure and kind of credibility. Because selling to these shops is a terrible way of making money. So if you go with a distributor, so that's someone who will take your magazines, they have their list of shops that they'll take it to, and then they'll take care of everything from that point on. So they'll invoice the shop and make sure the money comes back. The distributor is going to take about 40% of the cover price for doing that. So, and it's not like it's not like they're sort of like rubbing their hands with glee. and running off with all your money because about 20% of it needs to go to the shop. So 20% for the shop, 20% for the distributor, 60% say left for you. But then if you're dealing in sale or return, obviously that's 60% of the magazines that sell. So you see how this pie gets like really small really quite quickly. Your alternative is, instead of using a distributor, um, you do it yourself. So, and actually, I think this is a good idea, particularly for people starting out, because if you've got an idea of where you want your magazine to be, you can take the magazine to those places yourself. You can, sort of like follow up and manage that relationship. It is obviously time consuming, but I'd say that you're also in that gaining a really good full understanding of what it means to sell your magazine through shops. So I think that, a lot of publishers kind of start out doing that themselves and then bring a distributor on for, like, a subsequent issue once they feel like they can't manage that anymore. But for all that, it's a really good thing to be in these magazine shops because that's the sort of place where someone who's interested in finding a magazine will go. It also means that you are in competition with every other magazine in that shop. So, you're there on the shelf, and straight away you're kind of like, shouting, trying to shout above all the other magazines that are there. So I think that it's a really good idea if you are going to do retail, and I think you probably should. It's a really good idea to think on about, okay, like, what are the places where we could sell this where there'll be no other magazines in there. So to give you an example, Noble Rot is it's a wine magazine, but it sort of like mixes like kind of wine and music and sort of like popular culture. And they also now have like a couple of restaurants in London. They're doing really, really well. And in the little kind of independent off license near my house, um, when a new issue comes out, Noble Rot is sitting on the counter just next to the till. So basically, I've spent a few minutes choosing my nice bottle of wine. It makes sense that I might then want to spend like another £12 on a cool looking magazine to read while I'm drinking my bottle of wine. I just think that, like, all kind of the circularity of that just all matches up brilliantly well. And so that has informed the magazine that they've made. So if you see this in the flesh, it's kind of like, it's small, it's kind of just off below A5, I think, because that's the sort of object that can sit next to the till in a little off license. So I think that, kind of when you're thinking about what your magazine could be, imagining who your ideal customer is and where they are and how they're going to come across it can be really useful. But and that genuinely lends itself as a creative question for, like, okay, what's this thing that we're trying to make now? So selling through your own store online, the big advantage is you're going to keep all of the money because you'd have to share it with a distributor or your retailer. It's also really quite easy these days. I mean, I think everyone's used to buying things from a Shopify interface. So there's that kind of reassurance, like, for the customer when they come to your shop. They select the thing that they want, they put in their shipping information, they choose their shipping option, and it all feels like really familiar. Shopify, I mean, so we use Shopify to run our online shop, and it's genuinely really good. Like, it's really easy to maintain. It's got like tons of useful analytics that come out of it. And when awkward stuff like having to charge VAT to customers buying in the EU comes up, like it did a couple of years ago, they were really on it and like figured out, okay, how to charge VAT and do all of that. So there are lots of reasons to do that. And I think actually, I can't really think of any independent magazine that doesn't sell through its own store. Just kind of like, I don't see why you wouldn't, basically. The trouble with that is, man, the customer service is like, once I finish this, I have got some emails waiting in my inbox, which I need to do before the end of the day, responding to people who've bought things, but they're not with them yet. It's just like, it's really, really frustrating. Posting stuff these days is just getting more and more expensive and more unreliable. And we live in an Amazon world. So basically, anyone who buys something from us, like, a company of two people, it effectively expects the same level of service that they get from one of the biggest companies in the world. And the thing is, like, obviously we do that in our own way and the best we can. And so, you do find normally when somebody contacts you and they might be a little bit upset about something, just by responding quickly and by being a human rather than like, kind of a bot or something, very quickly you get past that sort of like, I guess, barrier. And you can say, all right, really sorry about that. We're sending you another one. I mean, it does basically always end up with us just sending out another magazine. So, we're paying for the shipping on that, we're paying for the magazine, but this is how you do things. Like, this is the way that we live. So there are, like, for all that I think you totally should sell your magazine online, it does bring with it a bunch of like really frustrating problems. And one of the biggest ones is that by doing it like this, you start from scratch every time. So you bring your magazine out, again, like, you've sunk like, hours and days and weeks into making this thing. You put it out there in the world, and then you got to start promoting it and trying to get people excited about it. And maybe you could get a bit of press about it, but then when you've made your next one, you've got to do that whole thing again. And it is genuinely difficult. It's difficult to kind of cut through and get people's attention. This is Weird Walk. So Weird Walk's kind of like a little zine all about sort of ancient British, like, magic and paganism, but also like, just going for like a nice walk in a field and like looking at a big tree. And one of the things that they do amazingly well is their partnerships. So they're the guys who run it, run record labels. So, kind of guess they have sort of like connections and stuff, but they'll do like a partnership with, in this case, you can see it's Printed Goods. So that's like an apparel company. They already have their own list. They, kind of, they've got their audience already. So like when Weird Walk does something like this, they're not trying to sort of like go at the whole thing themselves. They've got like a bit of support along the way. So, they'll put this in front of their audience, Printed Goods puts it in front of their audience, and kind of like by being together, by standing together, they kind of stand a bit taller. Okay, subscription. Now, given that I run a subscription company, you won't be surprised to learn I really like subscription. The best thing about it is you can plan a little bit ahead. You can get an idea of, okay, we're going to need, come the summer, we'll need this many magazines. So it means that you can sort of plan the size and shape of your business. It also means that you can build a relationship with your customers. And so, as I said about the shop customers earlier, we also hear from our subscribers every now and then because a magazine hasn't reached them, so something's gone wrong. But the tone of the communications with subscribers is so different to the tone of the communications with our shop customers. And it's totally understandable. If you've just come across Stack, maybe you'd never heard of us before, but you've seen this magazine that you want and you buy it, and then it doesn't turn up, like, that's annoying. You don't know who we are. You've got no reason to think that we're good people who are not going to leave you high and dry. So there's this kind of like baked in sort of like anger that comes with it. Whereas with our subscribers, they don't think that. Like, they know a little bit about who we are. We have probably delivered lots of other magazines to them in the past, and it's been fine. So that there's just this kind of well, it's a relationship. There's this kind of understanding that we can build on, and that we can, hopefully keep those people, keep them subscribing, and give them a really good service. The problem with subscriptions is it's really stressful, because if you take people's money for doing something, and clearly you need to do that thing, and so I mean I'm like constantly looking at, okay, what's our liability? What have we taken money for here that we need to fulfill down the line? Christmas is our biggest time of the year by a long way. And so, typically we kind of like come out of Christmas with loads more subscriptions, like lots more money, but we can't just spend that money, because that then has to be sort of like eked out through the year. It's also incredibly complicated. So we use a piece of software called ChargeBee, which is like a subscriptions marketing platform, and that really helps. Back when I started, I had two spreadsheets, and one spreadsheet was everyone's names and addresses, and the other one was just cells filled in with the number of months they'd paid for. And every month I'd do like a mail merge and then delete a column and shift it all along. And like, how on earth that didn't go terribly wrong, I just don't know. Running subscriptions is just a difficult thing to do. So I would say, like, kind of, you shouldn't get into it lightly, but if you are serious about making a magazine and making it a long-term thing, I think it's a really good option to look to. One thing that we're seeing a lot more these days is magazines that don't plan to run forever. So this is a magazine called Dirty Furniture, which is what we sent to our subscribers last month. And it launched on Kickstarter 10 years ago, and basically said, we're going to do 6 issues. So basically, I think way back then, you could buy all 6 issues up front. But he was like, we're going to do 6 issues. And then once that's done, that's done. So this is the 6th issue. They have now just finished. And I'm going to be interviewing them next week. Yeah, next week, talking about exactly this, kind of why they went for this like sort of limited amount of time. But I think one of the reasons they'll say is that, they wanted to have this kind of definable project, this thing in front of them, so that basically they weren't on the hook for making something forever. They could just do it for like a defined amount of time. Okay, so that's that's like my very hastily spoken advice. Um, the danger with doing all this is that it makes it sound like, kind of, well, this is it, this is how you do it. Obviously, that's not the case. There are no rules to any of this. I think particularly with what we're seeing, not just with print magazines at the moment, but the media as a whole, we're seeing these like, mass layoffs. We're seeing like really well-known, really well-established brands being folded into other brands, or just kind of like broken apart. I think the thing that's behind all of that is we've got away from this idea that the thing you need is a product that somebody will care about enough to spend some money and pay for. And I think that actually print magazines have a little bit of an advantage on this over digital, because it is a little bit easier to go to somebody and say, look, here's this thing that I've made. Here's this like physical object that I've made. It costs £10 or however much. If you can do that in whatever form, like if you're doing it online or in person or via subscription or whatever it is, if you can make that work, then you have the basis of a business that can actually run and keep on going. I'd say the main things that you should try to have in mind is, who is this for? Where will they find it? And how is this thing going to make money? And as I say, don't look to what other people have done and think, well, okay, so they made it this size, or they made it this many pages. Everything that you're trying to do, all the questions that you need to ask yourself about what your magazine should be, all of those questions should be answered by this core reason for why you're making it in the first place. If you can do that, then I think you stand the best possible chance of making something that is distinctive and that people will care about and that they will want to spend money on. And I think that gives you the best possible chance of success.